We could be headed for a snap federal election as early as this fall. And so Elections Canada is ramping up its plans for how to hold a vote during a global pandemic. Some of the ideas the agency is proposing include a 2-day weekend voting period instead of the traditional 1-day Monday vote, allowing mail-in ballots sent in before the voting deadline to be accepted until the day following that weekend vote, so we might not have results right away as a consequence. Some of the other stuff they have in the works includes implementing physical distancing at polling places, possibly even cutting the number of volunteers needed, buying masks and single-use pencils so you're not sharing with other voters, and eliminating the Vote on Campus program because many classes have, of course, moved online. To talk about how an election might even be possible during such strange times, we're joined now by former Chief Electoral Officer Jean-Pierre Kingsley. He's near Rockland, Ontario. Mr. Kingsley, wonderful to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for making the time. I want to start off with just sort of a broad perspective from you, if you don't mind, on the possibility of an election during the pandemic. How unprecedented would it be? How strange would it be from your perspective?
Well, totally unprecedented and obviously strange. But obviously, from what the Chief Electoral Officer has told us in that report, feasible. Feasible if Canadians are willing to be reasonable, to be patient, to understand how different an election this would be. And you've highlighted some of those points about physical distancing. I mean, one can imagine what would happen at the polls. And as well, what would be happening in terms of the people serving Canadians at the polls. They would have to have physical distancing as well because, you know, their health is important as well. So everything would be quite different. I can only imagine that the Chief Electoral Officer would be hoping to have an election period that's more than 36 days, which is the minimum under the statute right now. It can go up to 50. I'm not suggesting 50, but I'm saying it, you know, all the time that the Chief Electoral Officer would have during the election to make adaptations as they're necessary. These are important considerations.
I was going to ask you about that campaign length there. So you think 50 might be too much, or it's somewhere in between, you know, the 30 plus mark and 50?
Well, I'm not saying 50 would be too much. I'm saying it's not necessary that it be 50, but I am saying more than 36. I mean, when you get into the 45, 46, it becomes something that the Chief Electoral Officer can be handling as the event unfolds. Obviously, if it's 36, it's 36. I mean, that's what Chief Electoral Officers are there for.
So what do you think about the concept of a 2-day vote held over the weekend?
Well, number one, it must be remembered that what the Chief Electoral Officer said was that legislation would be required in order to make this happen. But a 2-day extension to the vote, I mean, on a Saturday and on a Sunday, obviously people would be entitled to respect their religious observance practices. But those who can and wish to vote on a Saturday could do so. Those who can and wish on a Sunday could do it as well. And if we ever get to that stage, it'll be interesting to see just how many people take it up and what kind of an experience it is. Because a lot of people have been thinking about that Monday not being a holiday for such an important event as an election. And this would give us an idea of just how feasible it would be and how acceptable it would be to Canadians. Now, I'm going to come back to the legislation part, because if there's legislation on electoral matters, that takes time. The Chief Electoral Officer will make proposals to Parliament. Parliament will have to take the time to review that, cogitate, and then once it's passed, the Chief Electoral Officer then must devise the means whereby this will become a possibility and test those means, especially if computers are involved. I mean, you just don't want to go into an election with a computer program that has not been tested, that's for sure.
Based on what you just said, to my mind, that doesn't sound like something that can happen overnight. That would obviously take time. The legislation portion of it takes time, and then the testing out of it takes time. If, in fact, there is something like a fall election, that time will be a luxury, right? Is it still possible?
Not the Sunday, not the Saturday and the Sunday vote, but an election is still possible, yes. And this is what the Chief Electoral Officer is telling us, at least my reading of it, in that report. And he's talking about the fact, you know, people will have to be cognizant of the fact that recruiting staff is going to be harder. I mean, 35% of the staff, and there's about close to 300,000 people who are hired during a Canadian election, which is something we forget. But these are the people who receive us at the polls, et cetera, and in writing, in the RO's offices. 35% of those are above, or 60 or above. And that's the population that's most at risk in this pandemic. So how do you recruit replacements for that? On top of that, if we go in for additional postal voting, and we really don't have much choice about that, we would be into postal voting. How you handle those extra ballots coming in to each riding to be tabulated, because that's where they're being tabulated in each of the ridings. They're received centrally, but they're redistributed, okay? And they have to be tabulated. We might even have an election where we don't know the results on election night, because so long as those ballots were received by 6 o'clock on the final day of the vote, on the Monday of the vote, by Elections Canada, they're to be counted. Okay, they have to be counted. And Elections Canada even made special measures to go to the post office at 6 o'clock to make sure that they gathered as much of the ballots as possible, as many of the ballots as possible. So all of that to say, when we invoke the need for patience, we could even be into an election where we don't know the results before we go to bed.
Wow, that sure would be interesting for not only Canadians, but us, those of us planning TV coverage.
You'd be back to the good old days where you have talking heads who would be very busy and have something to say.
What's that like? But before I let you go, I just wanted to get your take, I guess, on the importance of being able to hold an election period. And I guess this speaks to a conversation that's happening all around the world. But we're in in this pandemic, it's made life for so many people very difficult. Is there a circumstance under which, and I know the Chief Electoral Officer outlined that there may be an extreme circumstance in which the recommendation is to delay the election. But as someone who's been, in that position, what would, how much would it take for you to actually to say this election shouldn't happen now? How high is the bar for that?
Well, it would be pretty high, and it would have to be something which makes the present situation worse, okay? Because the Chief Electoral Officer has told us what he can do under the present circumstances, invoking, of course, the need for Canadians to be patient and understanding about the time that voting would take and so on and so forth. But all of that being said, if the situation remains as it is, an election is possible. But what is being missed in this whole conversation, I find, is that why should we expect an election? We voted for the parliament that we have. If this were a majority government, it would still have been elected by only 40% of the people, and we would not be talking about an election. Why are we talking about an election at this time when the Prime Minister has the opportunity to work with members of the opposition and to come up with a speech from the throne which is acceptable to at least one of the opposing parties? And I think that this is what Canadians would expect. At the same time, it would be a good example for us to remind ourselves minority governments do work. Number one, they're a reflection of our will. We are the most sophisticated electorate in the world, in my view. And we voted for a minority government. Make it work, please.
I take that point very much. I think the reason that I'm talking about it and the reason that we're talking about it is because, of course, the Prime Minister has said that there will be a confidence vote, but you're absolutely right. The government just needs to find people from other parties to work with, and then they'll be able to sail through that confidence vote, and the election will not happen this fall. I completely take your point, Mr. Kingsley. I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time, as always.
Pleasure. Thank you.